And then it goes through the thing that Paris calls in the local physician, tells everybody, oh, well, this is not necessarily a medical issue. Maybe it's devil. Something to do with the devil. Something to do with the forces of evil. Now, this just sort of pops up on the radar. And this is where a lot of people think that the Salem Witch Trials and everything that was about the whole witchcraft thing, where it sort of starts. And everybody focuses, a lot of people, on the 1690s specifically because that's where the trials actually happened. What I'm going to talk about today is that this actually began a long time before that. The power structures that were in place, the things that allowed people to do what they did by the 1690s, I believe were orchestrated very clearly, mainly by one, maybe two men. And you'll hear the name Cotton Mather. We're going to talk about who that is, what he had to do with all of this. But first, let's give a little bit of history to Mr. Paris. Mr. Paris was actually a failed merchant who had originally come from Boston, which is the area of Cotton Mather's church, which was not too far from Essex County, which is where Salem is located. How he became the pastor at Salem Church is a study all of itself, but he was invited there by a particular family, whose name you'll see if you've gone through the Salem Witch Trials transcripts, the Putnam family. So here's this family that invites Paris to come to the Salem parish to have a church, to be the pastor, and then shortly after that, these two people, these two families, become almost exclusively the accusers of all the people who were witches. Now, when you look at that and you start asking questions, that's what I started doing. I thought, well, how did this happen? How is this just some kind of weird coincidence? You've heard the competing theories that, the strange behaviors that were happening were a result of maybe exposure to some type of fungus, some type of strange, hallucinogen that was present in the area. But I don't think that theory really answers all of the different points, and we're going to talk about that initially. So you'll see, as I've written up here, dynamics. The societal dynamics, things that were happening in the area. First thing I want to say is, obviously, strange behavior. All right? And let's go to the next one here, paranoia. And here's where it gets interesting. Witchcraft label, and then accusations. So if it was just the exposure to some type of hallucinogen that created the strange behavior, then why all of this? If someone's acting strangely, is the first thing that you would conclude that they're a witch? Was that the natural conclusion for people even in that period of time? There was superstition. But where did that come from?
Their religion, possibly?
That's exactly where I think it came from. Now, I want to be clear. My background is largely in the church. And so I'm not coming at the church as some type of evil institution. But I think, as with any institution, there is plenty of opportunities for abuse of power. And especially in this period of time, there was definitely an abuse of power. And that's what I'm going to try to establish today as a competing theory for what was actually happening. So we have these dynamics. And if you'll look at your handout there, on the second page, you're going to see some excerpts. Now, these excerpts were written in the 19th century, so 110, 120 years after the Salem Witch Trials. If you want to get some real detailed information from a competing viewpoint, you want to research Charles Upham. Charles Upham. He goes in and he digs into exactly what was going on. Now, that'd be considered a secondary source, but it's good information, and it's one of the authoritative examinations of what was going on during Salem's issues here. But if you look at the second excerpt that I have on page 2, it says, such was the political nature, this is Upham writing, and public administration of the province of Massachusetts during the summer of 1692, under which the witchcraft persecutions were carried on. It was conducted by men whom the Mathers had brought into office and who were holy in their councils. If there is, I repeat, an instance in history where the particular persons are responsible for the doings of a government, this is one. I conclude these general views of the influence of increase in Cotton Mather upon the ideas of the people and the operations of the government eventuating in the rich witchcraft tragedy by restating a proposition which under all the circumstances cannot, I think, be disputed, that if they, speaking of the Mathers, had really and earnestly opposed the proceedings at any stage, they could and would have stopped them. What he's saying here is that the Mathers were the primary influence. And if you read the next section here, the next excerpt, he says, whoever examines carefully this letter to Richards, this is a letter from Mathers to Richards, cannot, I think, but conclude that instead of exonerating Mather, it fixes upon him the responsibility for the worst features of the witchcraft trials. Now, what's interesting with Mather, he's probably the most educated person in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He is the premier pastor. He's the pastor of the First Church at Boston. He's a Presbyterian, a Puritan, and he is an extremely well-educated, but I think also a very, very dangerous man. Now, if you hear him write about himself, he's the savior of the colony. He's literally, he writes a book anonymously that ended up being attributed to him anyway, where he portrays his father and himself as Orpheus and Mercury, as these mythological characters that are saving the colony. And he was constantly looking for self-aggrandizement. Now, this is in the record. I can't give you instances of every single thing that I'm asserting right now. You would have to read these things yourself, but I have given you the sources where you can go in, and we're talking hundreds of pages, but it is going to be fascinating if you take the time to look into it. It's all there. And I've given you on that handout on the first sheet a number of excerpts that point this out with the page numbers. You can go to archive.org. If you pull your email, I had Marion send you an attachment. It's going to be a lot easier to do that instead of typing this stuff in with your thumbs. You can click on those links. They're hyperlinks in that email from these same documents, and it'll take you right to the books that I'm talking about that have this information in them. These books were digitized by various colleges. They're over 320 years old, and you can literally sit there and read them. It's the coolest thing ever, at least for a history buff. But at any rate, that being said, these guys were in charge. The Mathers were basically in charge of the religious community, but they were also in charge of the legal community. Now, this is one of the main reasons why we have the separation of church and state. That wasn't happening here. But what happened here is one of the main things that drove it. Because what would happen is when the church had something that they thought was a concern, they would bring in the magistrate to enforce religious rules on people in society. I have 40 pages of snips that I created from original documents here from the Essex County court records dating from the 1600s. And I went through all of the Essex County records and created snips, about 40 pages of them, that document the types of offenses that were being prosecuted. So hang in there with me. We're going to loop this around here as to why this matters. But say, for instance, one of the things I note is that the number of religiously themed cases began to spike in 1641, 1642. This is about 50 years before the witch trials. The reason for this is that there was a passage of a law called the Body of Liberties. And it was put into effect largely because the ministers of Salem and Massachusetts Bay Colony went to the people who were in charge of the colony and said, we want these laws. And so they basically tried to create an Old Testament society. And one of the links that I have there on the page will take you directly to one of the books in the laws of in the Body of Liberties that says, witchcraft is a capital crime. That's going to cost you your life. Why? Well, because in the Old Testament it says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Now the question was, how do you determine if someone's a witch? And that's really where Cotton Mather and these other guys came in. You see, one of the things that I wrote in my thesis, I'll read you some things. I hope it's not too boring for you here. But the law prevented clergy from serving as officers of the court, but the expertise and morals of the clergy were nonetheless at the heart of the court decision, making the laws of the church the laws of the land. Ironically, the check and balance of colonial law was the collective integrity of the clergy and the officers of the church. As the record shows, the system of checks and balances was not enough to prevent the powers of financial and corporal punishment consolidated within the said officers from overwhelming their collective judgments. The power structure itself contained a fatal conflict of interest in that it rested on the quicksand of human nature, giving oversight to the same persons who exercised the power. So if I wanted to do something, the person who told me I could do it was me, and the person who held me accountable for doing it was me. There's a serious conflict of interest there. Now, especially when you have these dynamics, and I'll read a couple of other things that these are all research regarding the colony. The colony at Massachusetts in particular was known for its brutality. It was started as a religious experiment in 1620. The people came over from England. They had this charter, and they wanted to form a Puritan civilization, one that had never existed before. They were fleeing from persecution because they couldn't do that in England. But when they got to here, they were not going to return that courtesy to those who were under their power. It says here, one of the main reasons that they came here was to win greater independence from the crown in matters pertaining to the company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, and the individual autonomy. These men wished to, quote, enforce the laws of God and win divine favor, creating in New England the kind of society that God demanded of all his servants, but that none yet had given him. There was a religious zeal here. And there's nothing wrong with religious zeal, unless it's so pragmatic that you don't really care the kind of things you have to do to accomplish your ends. And that's what was happening here in New England. Now, it says this is not to say that the colonial effort was strictly religious, because it was not, but rather that it was the intention of these men to shape the very fabric of the settlement by means of religious principle. By 1630, the leadership and shareholders of the Massachusetts Bay Company were underway to the New World. Now, speaking of the judiciary, Edward Morgan, a scholar about this time period, he says, pious but unlearned men were called upon to act as supreme judiciary and enjoyed a power in judicial matters equal to that of the wisest and most learned magistrates in the land, and only by the negative voice could the magistrates prevent them from committing the grossest of errors. Sounds like a great court system to go to, right? I'm going to go into a judge that doesn't know anything and has all kinds of power that I can't get away from. He says here one of the main problems in the New England court system was delinquents could not escape the godly as readily as they did in England by setting different jurisdictions against one another. If the church and state unified against a person, there was no alternative path. Mather made sure that the church and state were unified. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. In 1641, the colony had adopted what is known as the Body of Liberties, which is the civil and criminal laws that were codified along with scriptural marginal notes. Penalties were largely based on penalties from Old Testament Jewish law. The church also provided oversight of education. So not only did they control the legal system, they controlled the education system, and of course, the church itself. The grip of the church on society was so complete that a narrative that does not take this into consideration would lose significant insight. The church relied heavily upon the court to protect its rule, sometimes securing judgments at or beyond the edges of available law. For instance, the statutes contained nothing that would allude to silencing people for disagreement with a pastor's sermon, and yet the court records that I have right here are full of just such things. So we have a church that sets up what the laws for the court are going to be, and then every time someone disagrees with the pastor or the elder for preaching something that maybe he shouldn't be preaching, saying something that they disagreed with, they got hauled in before the magistrate for slander and fined, put in stocks, sometimes whipped. Now that to me points to a severe conflict of interest, to where the church was using the court system to try to bring itself absolute power. And there was no government that was going to hold them accountable. They were the government. Now, that may not normally be a problem if you don't have people that are in power who have bad intentions. But any student of history is going to tell you that the thing you learn the most is human nature does not do well resisting the pull of absolute power. You've heard it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's a reason for that. So here you have this guy that may have had the best of intentions, but then realizes that power is within his grasp, and he decides he's going to do what he has to make this godly experiment go forward. Enter Cotton Mather. Upham talks about an instance with what's called the Goodwin children. And if you look at your handout, it's the second paragraph, the larger second paragraph down, he writes this: "It is so obvious that in this whole affair," and I don't agree necessarily with his assertion, but he was writing this 170 years ago, 180 years ago. It says, "It's so obvious that in this whole affair, Cotton Mather was grossly deceived and audaciously imposed upon," I don't believe he was deceived at all, "by the most consummate and precocious cunning that it needs no comment. I have given this particular account of it because there is a reason to believe that the reason to believe that it originated the delusion in Salem. It occurred only 4 years before Dr. Mather's account of the transaction filled the whole country, and it is probable that the children of Mr. Parris's family undertook to reenact it." What's he talking about? He's talking about an incident with the Goodwin children. The Goodwin children, some general remarks upon the criticisms of the North American Review. So Upham had written an article, actually written a two-volume book, and the North American Review was a magazine at the time, and it had critiqued his view because it denigrated Cotton Mather's reputation, which of course nobody wanted to do because the guy still had a lot of power. But nobody wanted to talk about the ugly side of it. And nobody, even 100 years after the fact, wanted to expose what Mather was doing. And yet you have people like Caliph, who I've also referenced in your notes here, who wrote and published in 1700, just less than a decade after the witch trials, who clearly come out and accuse Mather of exactly what people are trying to defend him from 100 years later. An inconvenient truth. Nobody wanted to tarnish his reputation, but Caliph basically calls him a hypocrite. Now he says, and these are, I recommended this, I think this is this is down at the bottom, pages 1 through 7 at a minimum. I recommend reading if you're going to dig into this view a little bit more, because this specifically brings out the accusations against Mather. Now it says, he quotes Caliph, he says, writing to the ministers of the country, March 18, 1694, says, I having had not only occasion but renewed provocation to take a view of the mysterious doctrines which of late have been so contested among us, could not meet with any that had spoken more or more plainly the sense of those doctrines than the Reverend Cotton Mather. But how clearly inconsistent either with himself or the truth, I meddle not now to say. but cannot but suppose his strenuous and zealous asserting of his opinions has been one cause of the dismal convulsions we have here lately fallen into. More and more of Upham's material, which I won't take the time to read, basically states that Mather, in the case of the Goodwin children, in his own parish, took one of the children of this family that was behaving the way that the children in Salem ended up behaving, took them into his home for the entire winter. Mm-hmm. And wrote a bunch of papers about it, developed sermons about it, and published those documents all throughout the colony. As this gentleman here pointed out, he said he was obsessed with the devil. Upham says it even more clearly. He said his whole mind was inflamed with this idea that New England was going to be attacked by the forces of darkness. So Charles Upham says this regarding Cotton Mather. And you'll read that in those first 7 pages that I've listed there. Now, when I started thinking about this, I thought, okay, if anyone associated with people who were claimed to be witches, if anybody ever associated with them, they were often able to be accused themselves. The only people who were immune from that were the clergy. They could have as much interaction with the people who were accused and never be brought under suspicion. I'm going to give you an example of some of the things that may have been happening, because I find this example very illustrative. This comes from 1654, court held at Salem. Elizabeth Du alias Hewlett, wife of Cornelius Hewlett, for slanderous speeches. This is the charges that were brought against her. Mr. Zerubbabel Endicott, who becomes one of the main players, Endicott, she accuses Mr. Zerubbabel Endicott in fathering her child upon him, to be whipped 20 stripes on same lecture day, and a paper to be penned upon her forehead with this inscription in capital letters, a slanderer of Mr. Zerubbabel Endicott. So basically what happens is a woman, a married woman, accuses a pastor of being responsible for fathering her child, and this is how they treat her. Because this guy's related to one of the most powerful magistrates in the land. Now, could that same dynamic be happening? Absolutely, in my opinion. Where you have people who feel it within their grasp to start using this system. And you see little sparks of it in the 50s and in the 60s, and all of a sudden in this big section between the 60s and 80s, 1660s to 1680s, you see this huge spike of religious-themed prosecutions.
Excuse me. What were the symptoms that the original children were showing that Mather?
That's a good question. So the original things is that they were running around barking like dogs. They were showing all sorts of excitable behavior. Upham talks about this, Caleb talks about this, where they were shouting blasphemies. In fact, I think
these first children that Cotton Mather took into his home were barking and blaspheming.
Yes, and here's one of the funny things. Cotton Mather writes this whole group of documents about this. And only one of the children was taken into his home, but there were other children of the Goodwin family that were also experiencing the same thing. But when they deprived them of food for 5 days, they stopped it.
Well, yeah.
Which points to the fact that it wasn't a hallucinogen, because it didn't come back. Points to the fact that it was maybe an act.
So was he basing one accusation on one child and saying this is what's happening to all of our children?
That's what ended up happening. Basically what he did is he took this child into his home as a case study and wrote these things that people say are extremely credulous and almost childish in their analyzation of this whole thing. And this is why Upham, in that fragment that I read there, says that he was deceived by precocious behavior. But I don't think that's the case. What I believe happened, based on what we're getting to here, is that he took this child into his home. The other children were basically shown to be frauds by what they were doing. By when they were deprived of food, they stopped their behavior.
Well, they were too weak, though.
The one that was in his house, he learned everything about how they were doing their thing. Had months to figure this out. And then he published a bunch of things about it that were assertions about what evil forces do to children. Mr. Paris, the greedy guy who was a failed merchant, decided he was going to go to Salem to be the pastor down there, reads the accounts that Mather has written. And all of a sudden, his children began exhibiting the same exact behavior that was happening with the Goodwin children. And the connection there is that Samuel Paris used to go to church at Cotton Mather's church. He was from the Boston parish. And he decides he's going to use this, because there's multiple things in the record that show he was a greedy man. We're going to talk about this in a few moments.
Yeah.
One of the big things about the law in Massachusetts is that when you were accused and you got sent to prison, the people who accused you of creating harm for them, they ended up being the beneficiaries of your property. And that property went to the freemen of the court, who then distributed it however they wanted. And the freemen of the court were people that were church members. So where did that wealth ultimately end up coming back to? Was the church.
So yeah, could you elaborate more on how that worked? So if you weren't a part of the church but you accused somebody of being a witch or being anything, is that what you're saying? Like any accusation, or
this was if the accusation was sufficient to warrant them being put in prison, then the people who received, this is the manner of reparations in those days. Okay. A person got imprisoned, and then their property went to the person largely who won the settlement.
Oh, okay.
They just gave your property away,
basically. They just gave your property away.
Was church attendance compulsory?
Church attendance was compulsory.
By everyone.
But only the freemen had the right to vote as voting members of the church. So there were people that were in the church that were not freemen, but freemen were sort of like landed gentry who had a lot of power, and they were the voting members of the community, they were the main members of the church, and they were also the officers of the court. So the pastor, who had the ability to bring them before the magistrates who had created the courts, who had written the laws for the courts, had the ability to use the court to rid the community of people that were doing things that they didn't think were proper religiously. And that began to spike again in the 1660s to the 1680s until the court of Oyer and Terminer was created. And this is where the whole thing with Mather comes to a head. So I'll just free lecture on this as opposed to reading each section of it. But Sir William Phipps becomes the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony about 3 months after this whole witchcraft thing starts. The problems that the colony was having that were stirred up by all the superstition, the whole colony was just in an absolute panic because of the publications of Mather and his father, Increase Mather and Cotton Mather. The jails were full of the accused. They had to start putting people in Andover prison instead of Salem prison. And there was no way to deal with all the cases because the charter had been revoked, which was basically the thing that guaranteed people their rights. When people said, well, why was the charter revoked? The people that were in magisterial power said, do you think that the provisions of the Magna Carta were going to follow you to the ends of the earth? Magna Carta was all about individual rights. Caleb documents this. He says this, so that it will not be wondered at that in the latter and the reign of King Charles II and of King James, when most of the charters in England were vacated, and finally judgment entered upon against it, and the country was put into such a form of government that was most agreeable to those times, via a legislative power that was lodged in the governor or president, and few appointed to be of his council without any regard therein either to the laws of England or those formerly of this colony. thus rendering the circumstances of this country beyond comparison, he's talking about New England, Massachusetts Bay, worse than those of any corporation in England. The people of those corporations being acknowledged still to have a right to the Magna Carta, when their particular charters were made void. But here, when Magna Carta had been pleaded, the people have been answered that they must not expect that Magna Carta would follow them to the ends of the world, not only their estates, but their lives, being thereby rendered wholly precarious. And Judge Palmer has set forth in print that the king has power to grant such a commission over his people. It is not hard to imagine that under such a commission, not only the people were liable to be oppressed by taxes, but also by confiscations, seizing of lands, unless patents were purchased at excessive prices, with many other exorbitant innovations. So just before the Salem Witch Trials took place, the colony lost its charter because of changes that were happening in England. Cotton Mather saw this as an opportunity. He said, we're going to draw up our own charter. I'm going to send my father to England, and he's going to plead for this charter to be put into place. And then we're going to put our own governor in place. Why did he need to do that? Because if anybody was the religious zealot who wanted to prosecute people in the colony for religious reasons, but did not yet have the power to do it, it was Cotton Mather. And this is why I tell you that it is not something, in my opinion, that happened because of fungus or some other item. Because this was not a reaction to what had happened. It's not like the church saw what was happening in the colony and then reacted to it. The church orchestrated what was happening in the colony and took advantage of it. And the person who was at the top of this, as I read already from the Upham quote, which I've given you there, he says, I repeat, and if there is, I repeat, an instance in history where the particular persons are responsible for the doings of the government, this is one. And the people he names there are Cotton Mather and his father. Now, Cotton Mather writes in his diary, which I have as your first excerpt. You tell me why he would be so happy about this. He was requested, speaking of Mather, by the magistrates of the crown to name the officers of the new government, and in fact had the free and sole selection of them all. This is the pastor of the Boston church. Same guy who took the good one into his home. Same guy who documented it. Same person who inflamed the colony. Same person who had a personal relationship with Samuel Parris, whose children are creating this same environment, but perhaps a different reason. See, I don't think Cotton Mather needed money. He was already rich. He was one of the richest men in the colonies. He wanted power. Samuel Parris was short-sighted. He wanted money. So they did what they did for a different reason, and Cotton Mather orchestrated most of it. Sir William Phipps was appointed governor at his solicitation. We're going to talk about that in a minute as well. And in accordance with earnest recommendations in a letter from Cotton Mather, William Stoughton, who became the lieutenant governor, who was also the main dude who sat on the magistrate court for Oyer and Terminer. Lieutenant governor. There's a conflict of interest. He was appointed deputy governor, thereby superseding Danforth, one of the ablest men in the province. In fact, every member of the council owed his seat to the Mathers. Making, and it says, and politically was their creature. Great was the exultation of Cotton Mather when the intelligence reached him, and thus expressed in his diary. This is what he writes about the fact that they revoked the charter, got a charter of their own, which allowed them to create the court of Oyer and Terminer, which allowed them to admit spectral evidence, which allowed them to take the lives of people in that community that had been troublesome to the church for maybe decades. He says this, the time for favor is now come. Remember, this is the religious zealot talking. Yea, the set time is come. I am now to receive the answers of so many prayers as have been employed for my absent parent, speaking of Increase Mather, and the deliverance and settlement of my poor country. He's like, now I finally got the power. We have not the former charter, the one that provided individual protections for people's rights that was based on the Magna Carta, but we have a better in the room of it. Not according to Caliph, Said it was the worst thing ever that allowed people to be oppressed, have their land confiscated. He says that's better. Why would he say that's better?
Because he can have even more power.
More power. And guess what happens when the church is the one that stirs all this up? And church attendance is compulsory, and everybody's scared of the devil kind of get to them, and everybody wants to be the next person to accuse. Church attendance increases. Tithes increase. Influence increases. Power increases. He had every motive and every reason to do this. And he says this. He says, we have a better one in the room of it, or in the place of it, one which much better suits our circumstances. And instead of my being made a sacrifice to wicked rulers, oh, poor Cotton Mather, such a martyr, all the counselors of the province are of my father's nomination, and my father-in-law with several related to me, and several brethren of my own church are among them. The governor of the province is no longer mine enemy, but one who I baptized, namely Sir William Phipps, and one of my flock, and one of my dearest friends. What's interesting about Sir William Phipps is that he was an illiterate idiot.
No.
He was a total lackey. And there's multiple documents that talk about the fact the guy could barely read. So he becomes the governor. Cotton Mather brings him into the church, baptizes him, and then recommends him to be governor, and then through him creates the oyer interpreter, because it had to come through the governor. The governor is the only one that had the power to do that. But the governor is literally eating out of Cotton Mather's hand. This is why Upham says what he says. He says if anyone was responsible for this, it was the Mathers. It didn't have anything to do with anyone else largely. And Samuel Parris is like, hey man, this is a good thing. I'm going to get in on this. Hey kids, read these books, read these stories. I want you to start acting like this. And we're going to create our own little scheme. Worked well for Mather. He's respected. He's got power. And I failed as a merchant, but I still want that money. And this is a good way to get it. Now, you say, well, that's a pretty strong assertion. Let's see what was happening to some of these people that were happening down in Salem province. You'll see on your first page there, Caliph, he documents a number of things that I've written here. On page 134 to 136, you'll see that there was a letter written by people in Parris's parish about the fact that they didn't like him.
Yes, that's in the record.
And that he was a greedy man. And they didn't want to pay him his salary. And guess where he took him? He took him to court. So he wanted his money. They weren't paying him enough to be the pastor down there. You better get in line. So, the interesting thing is, guess who the court recorder was? Him. So Samuel Parris is the court recorder. He gets to put the final word on everything that happens in the court as the pastor of the Salem church. He gets the final say. He gets to write what he wants to in the record book. And guess who's going to hold him accountable? Oh, that's right, him. So they had all the ends tied up. And interestingly enough, you know who wrote the final record of everything that happened with the Salem Witch Trials? Not the court. Not the magistrate. Cotton Mather. Who says he never went to any of the trials.
Oh boy.
He didn't have anything to do with any of the people that were there. Even though he shows up at the executions. Even though there's multiple places in the record that say the people were begging and pleading for their lives, addressing themselves to the ministers and the magistrates. Doesn't mean who they are.
Yeah.
So we may never know. But I wonder if people felt obligated, knowing that some of the people who were on the magistrate were also the head of the militia, who were also the lieutenant governor, who used the same jury on almost every case, who would send the jury back to redeliberate. Kai Erickson talks about that. You come back with the wrong verdict, you go back and you deliberate until you come back with the right one.
Yeah.
The right one being we don't like this person. Cotton Mather, my pastor, told me this person needs to be out of the community because we're doing a godly thing here. You need to do the right thing. Get rid of this person. Here's one really interesting thing. An Irish Roman Catholic. Now, we all know what the Puritans like to do with Catholics. If you remember, the Cromwellian Revolution was happening over in England right now. They were chopping people's heads off left and right. You're not a Presbyterian, you're dead. These are the people that came over. That's those people. The whole Cambridge platform of 1648 about the separation of church and state was specifically created because they were trying to make the Congregational church, they were trying to force them to be Presbyterians.
I didn't know that. But what about the Acts of Toleration? They were only in England, or?
Well, it was impossible to enforce them.
Uh-huh.
And when they revoked the charter and wrote their own charter, and then put their own governor into play, that was one of the people's biggest complaints. Mm-hmm. All their freedoms, their individual liberties were completely deconstructed. Didn't last for very long, and we're going to talk about that too.
I have a question. Like, who are the people that were accused, and like, were they just chosen at random, or was there specific reasons?
That's exactly what I'm getting to right now. I'm going to answer that. So, the colony, there's multiple things in the court records where Baptists would come down, Quakers would come down from Pennsylvania. They'd come to the colony and they were told, don't spread your faith here. You spread your faith here, we're going to kill you. They came down, they spread it anyway. So first they'd imprison them. They'd warn them, let them go. If they came back, they'd chop an ear off. They'd come back, they killed them. And it happened multiple times. So they were known for not having religious toleration. And there's a guy, Richard Godbeer, really excellent examination of this. I don't have time to get into it. But he basically said they were not going to extend to others the religious liberties that they claimed to be able to establish. There was only religious liberty for them. They became the tyrants that they ran away from. So an example of this says, in the times of Edmund Andros' government, Goody Clover, a despised, crazy, ill-conditioned old woman, an Irish Roman Catholic, was tried for afflicting Goodwin's children. This is the case that Mather was involved in. By the account of which trial taken in shorthand for the use of the jury, it may appear that the generality of her answers were nonsense. She couldn't even speak English. Yet the doctors, finding her as she had been for many years, brought her in compos mentis, and setting aside her crazy answers to some ensnaring questions, the proof against her was wholly deficient. The jury brought her in guilty. So the people that were accused, and this is really where the theory of everything else fails, is the accusations. You see, it was the children that were making the accusations. It wasn't the adults. But isn't it interesting that the people that were accused, the first 3 people that were accused in Salem province, one of them happened to be Sarah Goodman. I have this written down.
Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca.
It was Rebecca
Osborne and Sarah Osborne.
There were 3 people that were accused.
And Corey was
Well, that was a little bit later.
later, but it's Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Osborne, and there is another Sarah.
Kai has it here. So these 3, it was Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Notice what they were guilty of. One was expendable. This is Samuel Parris's slave. Number 2, Sarah Good, an unpopular woman who had reportedly muttered threats against her neighbors. Number 3, Sarah Osborne, who had allowed a man to live with her for some months before they were married. Now, back in the colonies, the law said that if you were caught in adultery or fornication, there was going to be some serious penalties, and usually it was a heavy fine. But ask yourself this: how is it that if the accusations were random, that the 3 people accused happened to have done things that were specifically offensive to the church. And how would a child know that? What are the chances of that? And who would it be in the know? Do you think the court recorder that was responsible for knowing who came to court, what they were accused of, how offensive that was to the church, do you think he may have known who was the people in the community that needed the most attention from the court, but couldn't get the justice verdict that he wanted? You see, they had motive, they had circumstance, opportunity, and they had the power. And there was no one that was going to keep them from moving forward. So these first 3 cases happen to all be things that were considered to be offensive to the church. And they just happened to be the people who were accused. Now here's the interesting part, the coaching part. I hope that answers your question a little bit more about who were the accused, what was the relationship to the accused, why were they being accused. My contention is that they were being accused because they were members of the community that the church wanted to deal with, but didn't have the opportunity. Now, another secondary source is written by Abijah Marvin. He's defending Cotton Mather. Imagine that. And he denigrates people who accuse him. And the reason why I know, and I didn't come across this until I was probably 3/4 of the way done with my research, and it was spot on. It comes from a disagreeing source. He's not agreeing with this. But he's saying people of this time and day, which you won't find really anywhere else in the record, were accusing Cotton Mather of this. He says, the author, this I find very interesting. The relation of Cotton Mather to the witchcraft horror demands the distinct attention. Remember, he's writing this in support of Mather. Should be made of the fact that while several prisoners were in jail, he offered to take 6 of the accused into his own family for the purpose of testing the same regimen that he had successfully tried in the case of the Goodwin children. So he's not backed away from it. He was involved in it all the way through. He hoped that others would follow his examples and that the results in restoring the afflicted to soundness would be beneficial. What a noble, altruistic cause. The authorities declined the proposal for reasons not given. Isn't that interesting? They said, no, we've had enough of that, Mather. That's not going to happen again. But you don't get any discussion on that. Perhaps they perceived that the baleful epidemic had spent its force. So maybe there was a good reason for that. But here comes to view a specimen of injustice which the maligners of Cotton Mather are adepts. In other words, he's saying they're such good critics. It is more than hinted by writers of reputation. These are people that were respected scholars, Caliph, Upham, that the design of Mather in his proposal was to get these bewitched into his house and under his influence, that he might from them elicit accusations against men obnoxious to himself, and thus bring them under his power.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In regard to this, there is no proof he ever used such power, which I feel is an absolute lie.
Luke, I have to have time for the students to ask you questions.
Oh,
So
how
are
long
you
have I
wrapping
been
up?
going? Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, it's almost an hour.
All right.
So at this point, there's plenty of evidence in the record. I've given you just some initial, really some sparks about this that I hope have piqued your interest to look at a competing theory that this was not necessarily the accidental convulsions of a superstitious community, but rather a community that was become superstitious because of the writings and orchestrations of a man who coordinated events to bring, of all things, children into a place where they were used and exploited by the church to accuse less than savory persons in the community of things of which they were not guilty, to do away with them. And I think that the attitude of the colony, the history of religious persecution, the pragmatism that dealt with torture and mutilation, the things that they were willing to do to try to achieve their ends is clear throughout the court record and the other historical records that have been written. And it'll take a few more minutes on this, but I'll just say this. There were multiple times, Caliph records them, where the children were in the process of accusing people that were brought into the courtroom. And when they would come in, the kids would throw themselves on the floor and yell and scream. And they'd point out and they'd say, "That's the person that's tormenting me." And they'd say, "Aha, you're a witch." Sometimes the kids didn't know who the accused were supposed to be. They'd forgotten. And the person who was standing behind them would bend down and whisper in their ear and say, "Don't you know old Jacobs? Don't you know?" And then "Oh yeah, that one." And Caliph records that. Does that sound like something that was accidental? Product of fungus?
Sorry, excuse me, until they went too far, right? That's how it ended.
Until they went too far. And that's exactly how it ended. We know that Phipps, being the instrument of Mather, really didn't have any reason to restrain himself because he was at the behest of Mather until all of a sudden Phipps' wife got accused. And all of a sudden, you have acquittals of over 70 people. Jails are empty. A general pardon is given. And the judges that were involved, with the exception of Stoughton, who thought it was the right thing to do all along, said, "Man, I wish we really hadn't done this. We put a lot of people to death." And Putnam, didn't have time to get onto the record to this today, was one of the primary accusers of almost every single person. Remember the Putnams and the Paris family together. They're in all the records. You take the time to go through there. I think Marion mentioned, she goes, "I can't believe how many people the Putnams accused." Ann Putnam in 1706 goes back to the church at Salem, who no longer had Samuel Parris as the pastor, and repented. It says, "I was nothing but an instrument. Can you forgive me?" And they accepted her back into fellowship.
Didn't Putnam have 3 relatives that all these symptoms started with in Salem?
Yeah.
So he started the...
Yeah. Oh, that reminds me, there is there's 40 pages here, but there's a very important quote here where this started specifically at his house.
At Paris's house.
At Paris's house in particular.
Yes, though the Erickson says makes it like, because the girls are listening to Tituba, and she's telling these stories, exotic stories from the islands, that puts it in their head. But you're saying that's not true.
It wasn't true.
That was not true.
Tituba was a scapegoat.
Yeah, well, no,
and
but
she was also under the power of Mr. Paris.
But she got out. She did not get jailed. She just got a wrist slap.
So I wonder why that happened.
Yeah.
Because he had the ability to protect the people who didn't want to be bothered. So
Right.
she could be the scapegoat. She could be the person who enthusiastically championed the idea that witchcraft was happening, that she'd been responsible for it, and Paris could get her off the hook.
Yeah, didn't she confess and then claim that witchcraft was, practiced by many in the area?
That's exactly right. But
Just
somehow
as everyone
nothing.
was getting acquitted.
Yes.
She just jumps out and confesses.
Right. And somehow nothing happens to her, even though she's supposedly at the root of the whole thing. And even after everything's done without her, the children keep accusing people for months. And the clergy says nothing.
Interesting. So, Luke, I need to have time for everybody who wants to ask you a question
Good.
to do so.
I'm basically done. I wanted
Okay.
to read that one section, but in Caliph, if you have the time to read it, I have the link there for you. You'll find the part, and you can digitally search. That's the fun part about archive.org. You can search for words, and it'll take you to the exact section of the book.
Okay.
I thank you for your kind attention, and hopefully, again, that piques your interest to look into this a little bit further and to realize that there's been a lot of lost voices
All right.
that tell a different story.
So, anybody who has not asked a question, I'd like you to raise your hand if you want the extra 2 points. Say your name so it's a little easier for Courtney, because she's recording, and ask your question. So, who'd like to ask Mr. Okay, and that's Kelly. We know Kelly had.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's always an event that marks a period of time that actually makes change happen. Like, wouldn't this be like a timely event to happen in order to bring like law and order into that community, being that there's so many like abuses of power to begin with?
Yes, I don't think that there was an intention for that to happen, but here's the fun part about democratic states, or really any state, is that people cannot long abide tyranny. So despite the best efforts of a tyrant, regardless of what his affiliation is, whether he's in the church, whether he's in government, whether he's in some other function, he can't maintain that grip of power forever. People will rise up, people will seek alternate routes, other governments will be formed, civil unrest will be created. And ultimately, this brought that to a head, and better laws were created, and but that was not the intention, because a tyrant never intends to lose power, but he always ends up losing power. I think Winston Churchill is the one that said, a tyrant is a person who rides a tiger that's become so hungry he cannot dismount.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately, I mean, every single tyrannical or totalitarian state ends up with this type of thing, and it's only if they're able to successfully crush all the resistance constantly, it's an impossible thing. It eventually results in better order. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, like with Clinton, when he was like persecuted for his table manners, would that be considered like a witch trial? Like when he was when Clinton was impeached?
For adults for lying to Congress about, I did not have sex with that woman.
Yeah, like would that be considered a witch hunt? I mean, historically speaking, like.
It's a difficult question to answer. In politics, there's a lot of hyperbole. And I would say that it becomes a matter of public perception that is needed to protect people's political interests. There are certain laws that are afforded and protected by the Constitution that allow for political conduct that may be on the outsides of ethical conduct. And whether or not that's a witch hunt, I think it would probably, just from a strictly historical point of view, it would probably do a disservice to the folks who are involved in something like the witch trials to compare something
Which is a real witch trial.
Mundane as
yeah.
an impeachment trial to what was happening there.
Right. All right. All right. We need to move on with Teresa. Courtney.
My question is, so there's the possibility of corruption, or high likelihood of corruption with Cotton Mather in the church, and do you think that could have spread to England, or if it moved from England to